I originally planned this video in 2020, late 2020, and it was going to be like a top 5 years thing. So what I did was I'd worked out which years had all my favourite games over the years and then narrowed them down and kind of ranked them, and then was going to do a top 5. But through planning and everything, I realised it was going to be a very long and very boring video. But what it did kind of make me think was that it's interesting, that question, what is the greatest year in gaming for you? And how much nostalgia and your age can affect your answer to that question. And we'll come back around to that point later. Now, there were a lot of good years on my shortlist. 1995, 96 and 97 were great years as DOS games were at their peak and the PlayStation and N64 had ushered in a new exciting era for console games. 2000 was pretty good and I have fond memories of that time. The PS2 was released and the Dreamcast was getting some great games. And although very recent, 2010 was actually a great year for PlayStation 3 games. Anyway, the top 5 years that I decided on in the end were 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993 and, you guessed it, 1994, literally one 5-year period. And I decided that 1993 was my greatest year ever for games. Now, why is that? Why are all my favourite games concentrated into that one period, and why the early 90s? Well, that's really the point of the video, because I think it really comes down to how old I was at the time. Now, I'm 42, 43 this December, so in 1990 I was 9 for the majority of the year. I would have been 12 in 1993, and I think that's a really landmark time in childhood for appreciating video games, or for me it certainly was anyway. Also, it was influenced by what I had home at that time during this period. We never had any consoles or computers prior to the 16-bit era. All I had at home were LCD games like the Sistema handhelds and one Game & Watch, which was Donkey Kong. Sure, I played games at the time, but it was always at other people's houses, whatever they had, you know, BBC Micro, Spectrum, Amstrad, Commodore 64, Master System. One of my mates had an NES, and of course I played a lot of arcades back in the 80s and early 90s. Then during this 5-year period in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to get a Sega Mega Drive, a Nintendo Game Boy, and then one day my dad came home with an Amiga 500. I'm not sure exactly when this happened, but he bought this Screen Gems pack, which was only sold from September 1990 to July 1991, so it was sometime during this window of 10 months or so. The Amiga was really the solidification of my love for games. It was so capable, the games were so diverse, and I could copy games with mates on the playground, so I had a ton of games. With the Mega Drive and Game Boy, I had to wait until Christmas or a birthday to have any hope of getting a new game. But copied discs allowed me to get new Amiga games all the time. So what was happening in 1993? Well, the Amiga was at its peak, still relevant and getting some absolutely superb games. The Lost Vikings came out in 1993, Sensible Software's Cannon Fodder, which is one of my favourites on the Amiga that I still play today, Lemmings 2, the Chaos Engine, Super Frog, The Settlers was a strategy game that I put a ton of time into. Bullfrog released Syndicate, another game that I still play a lot, and it's probably up there with the first two Monkey Island games as my favourites on the Amiga. But there were loads of great Amiga games that year. But in 1993, not only was the Amiga still relevant, but DOS gaming was in full swing. We had some absolutely superb LucasArts games that year. X-Wing was released. I spent countless hours playing this, and absolutely loved getting to pilot ships from Star Wars and participate in that universe, as Star Wars was a huge part of my childhood. They also released two of the greatest adventure games of all time, Day of the Tentacle and Sam & Max Hit the Road. Day of the Tentacle is also one of my all-time favourite games. Interesting time for PC gaming in general really, as CD-ROM drives had become more affordable, so the capabilities had really leapt in quality, especially with audio. Star Wars games could have really great soundtracks, and they could do full voice acting, Day of the Tentacle and Sam & Max talkie versions being great examples. And Intel's first Pentium processor was released in 1993. And we can't forget one of 1993's most influential games, a game that I still play a lot and have spent countless hours enjoying, Doom. Doom is the very definition of a landmark title, and it's hard to explain what a phenomenon it was at the time unless you lived through it. There were of course many other great PC games that year. SimCity 2000 was another one I pumped a lot of time into, but the LucasArts games and Doom was certainly my favourites. Then we had the consoles. Mega Drive was absolutely smashing it in 1993. Streets of Rage 2, which is easily my favourite Mega Drive game. That was actually released in 92 but didn't come to Europe until 1993. Megalomania came to Mega Drive after being first released on the Amiga in 91. Landstalker, another which was released in 92 but came to the West in 93. The first FIFA, Jungle Strike, Aladdin, absolutely epic year for Sega's console. Nintendo were on top form too. Game Boy was getting some good stuff. My all-time favourite Game Boy game, and a game that would easily make my top 10 from all time on any system, Link's Awakening, was released. The Super Nintendo got Star Fox and Super Mario All-Stars, which I would play at friends' houses. And then we have the arcade, which was killing it at the time, especially for beat 'em ups. We got one of my favourite Capcom brawlers that year, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, as well as the Punisher, NBA Jam, Ninja Baseball Batman and Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer is a good example of the shift in capabilities of arcade games at the time in terms of 3D. Before the PlayStation was released, arcades were pioneering 3D with games like this and Virtua Fighter, etc. It was an exciting time. But I want to bring us back to my original point, how much my age at the time has influenced my choice. Most of you watching will already be thinking of a completely different favourite year or era in gaming. You might be in your 50s and have a fondness for 80s arcade games. You might be 10 years younger than me and love the Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast the most. I had a discussion with my friend Steve recently, who's 6 years younger than me. He absolutely loves Ocarina of Time, as do many, whereas I'd always pick Link's Awakening as my favourite Zelda game. Now, when Link's Awakening was released in late 1993, it was just before my 13th birthday, and I got it for my birthday or Christmas that year. But Ocarina of Time was released just before my 18th. At the time, I wasn't playing single player games much. I was out socialising and drinking almost every night. The games I did play were local multiplayer games that I could enjoy with friends. Stuff like GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha, Bishi Bashi Special and so on. The reason I listed the year 2000 in my honourable mentions at the start is because that's the year I first moved out of my parents' house and got my own flat. We'd play Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 all night sometimes, and there are loads of multiplayer games from that era that I have very fond memories of. When Ocarina of Time came out, my mate Steve was 12, the same age I was when Link's Awakening was released, and that says a lot about our fondest memories of games. There are many factors: our age at the time, where we were living, what we had access to, and what we were doing in life. Maybe you got your first console one year, or your first family computer. It's interesting. Had I been younger when Ocarina of Time came out, perhaps that would be my favourite Zelda, who knows. But there's something magical about Link's Awakening for me. It really captured my imagination at the time with its story and world. And the same goes for the LucasArts adventures like Day of the Tentacle. Games were really becoming a means of telling a story, a proper interactive story. And I was just at the right age to appreciate that transition. It's a period of gaming that I will forever hold dear. So what do you think your favourite year or period in gaming is? And let me know in the comments, and more importantly, let me know why, because I think our answers will all be very different and quite interesting. Thanks for watching.